Hello everybody, welcome to the long-awaited MC SMP History 2. This history video is more chaotic than the first video. This video covers everything from December 2020 to November 2021. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 1 Credit Bubble Financial Crisis. We thought that the Essentials X economy would be our last currency change in the server. This was until we added mods. Through December of 2020, we began writing out transactions on paper due to the loss of plugins on our transition from plugins to mods. This was creating a really bad problem. No one had money. There was no exchanging goods. It was just a note in a book that said IOU, to be lost. We had to add an economy mod, but it was to no avail because it was almost 2 months of documented and undocumented transactions lost, and not everyone knew where they stood economically. Some people had large debts, and others had a mysterious amount of money they earned. The federal government decided to pay for the debts of those in the financial ruin in exchange for labor, and the others were taxed due to their unruly amount of cash. Eventually, the economy leveled out as the city began its first industrial boom. Chapter 2 Power Hungry. People quickly discovered that factories wouldn't just power themselves. The public quickly brought this to the attention of New York City's leaders. We began quickly designing an automatic, renewable power system for New York City. I began work on New York City's ethylene gas burning system. To make it simple, using a long and efficient process, we were able to take crops we grow and convert them into a power source, while being energy positive. This design is owned by the New York State NYSEG company, which was founded to fill the need for power. This new system wasn't our first, I will say. Long ago, we used biofuel instead of ethylene. Biofuel was less efficient and had been known to cause frequent power outages in New York, so it wasn't long before that design was replaced. Further down the road, NYSEG began experimenting with nuclear power. Since the energy demand was so high, it quickly exceeded our ability to use our tried-and-true ethylene method. We needed something much bigger, something more powerful. Chapter 3 Transcontinental. After mods were added to the server, people began experimenting. Mods didn't just boost the server economy, but expanded our country's borders, and will continue to. Since the world began in vanilla, all of the chunks near spawn and around the area of New York were generated before mods were added, so the raw resources and materials for most mods couldn't be gathered close to home. This created our transportation business. People began helping the newly founded American Locomotives Company lay the first rail beds to connect New York State to Connecticut. Many projects were scrapped and redone plenty of times due to failed designs and a lack of resources. For example, the underground transatlantic station. During the laying of the tracks, we also discovered a new continent, rich in raw materials needed for industrializing New York, so we founded 2 states, Connecticut and Alaska. Connecticut being the state for large-scale mining and logging, Alaska being the state for oil pumping. and more large-scale mining. New York's Elko also began its longest project, being the Transcontinental Railroad. This started in December 2020 and ended in May 2021. This was the longest trail of railroad tracks to carry farm, manufactured, and raw material goods to and from New York State. Chapter 4. Massachusetts. Players of the server began complaining about New York City's lag. After all of the machinery and factories were made, it was out of the question that lag would come. Some people pushed through it and others fled to Queens, New York for freedom from the lag. I began loosening government policies on the borough to let people that settled there expand. It wasn't long before they wanted to leave New York State to form Massachusetts. We let them become a state within the Union. We were pretty prosperous for a while until Massachusetts citizens began causing grief in New York City. We warned them that if they continued to cause problems, it would grow into an impending conflict. So be it. They pressed on, bugging people of New York, breaking property until New York gave them a bill. New York demanded $25,000 in reparation money in return to peace, or they would be subject to war. Again, so be it. Chapter 5. New York versus Massachusetts. Governors of both states held a diplomatic meeting discussing how it was going to go down. New York proposed that both sides would fight 3 individual battles. The majority winner would be the winner of the war. The losing state would have to pay war reparations. Massachusetts leader Jack agreed to those terms.
The battle was held close to Massachusetts' home front, near abandoned farming machinery.
Both sides dug out trenches and began battle. I was commander of the U.S. Army at the time, and my best officer available was TJP 0630. I sent TJP to the front lines to win the battle. Jack was also on the front lines for Massachusetts. First fighting began towards midnight, and New York took a devastating loss for the first battle. The fighting techniques used by Massachusetts troops weren't seen before, so I took to the front lines to fight myself. With my assistance in battle, New York won the remaining 2 battles in a landslide, marking an embarrassing defeat for Massachusetts. New York pitied Massachusetts in the unforgetful defeat by relieving the charges, under a condition of returning Massachusetts land back to Queens, New York to live under New York State rule once again. Chapter 6. Colonization. Long ago, we already began colonizing the New World with the founding of Connecticut. We used Connecticut for mass mining and logging, since it had a nearly unlimited amount of forest and ore beneath its floor. Although Connecticut had a lot of necessary ores to fuel this new industrial age, we needed more, so we founded Alaska and Virginia. Alaska was originally founded for mass mining, but quickly grew due to the discovery of black gold later on. Virginia was founded after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in May of 2021. Once mods were added to the server, New York transformed from an agricultural giant to an industrial metropolis, so they needed a place to farm elsewhere from the city. Virginia had massive plains that are now used for large-scale farming to feed New York's agricultural demands. Chapter 7. Black Gold. While working on the Transcontinental Railway, I began investing into the search to find crude oil. During the railway's construction, we used inefficient biofuels to run the train, which slowed down the construction process. I began looking for a solution. Refining crude oil seemed to be the answer. I began focusing the Transcontinental Railroad on building to Alaska to sample for oil. Along the way, I sampled hundreds of chunks for oil and found nothing. Days and nights of non-stop laying track and testing for oil. I was nearly ready to give up before I tested one last time and struck oil. I was thrilled. I quickly began pumping and filling tankers to ship back to New York and began building the first of the refineries. I brought the oil back to New York and refined the first batch. The increase of time efficiency and fuel-dependent machinery was astonishing. After countless times of bringing the train all the way to Alaska and back to New York over and over, I began wondering if New York had any oil for itself. If so, it would remove the tedious process of hauling tankers back and forth. A couple of tests, and it sure did. There were nearly 50 oil reservoirs in the boroughs of New York, and some still undiscovered. It was the jackpot. I began improving the refinery efficiency and sucking up part of the oil and storing it for emergency use. Before we knew it, we would have to call upon it. Chapter 8. Bronx Transfer Ship. As America started getting the natural resources from the new states, people were finishing their factories and were no longer improving the manufacturing of goods and overall way of living. So the economy became stagnant. To boost the economy, I transferred TJP 0630 over to govern the Bronx. The Bronx had a great location to be less laggy, unlike the massive borough of Manhattan, but still be right next door to everything. TJP asked me to check for oil on the Bronx, and so I did. We found 10 massive pockets of oil. I instantly capitalized on the new local oil source and began tapping it shortly after improving the refinery process. Selling the newly discovered fuels, liquid petroleum gas and kerosene stimulated the economy. Already letting TJP control the Bronx to boost economic growth was a success. Over time, he kept expanding roads, building new buildings, opening the Beekman Tower Hotel and Casino, and creating a new train station for transit of goods and people. But this effort didn't last as long as I had hoped, and the server's players base began losing interest for the time being. Chapter 9. The Great Recession. Once the first big boom of industrialization was coming to an end, we were seeing the new economic problem. During the industrial boom, the federal government gave out loans to local governments to spend on industrialization and expansion. These loans were extremely large, and the local governments never made back what they spent. This large amount of cash landed in the people's hands and increased the prices of goods all over. People were now making less money than the cost of basic living. The people couldn't afford goods anymore after spending all of their earnings, and because of that, they couldn't stimulate the economy. The federal government began searching for the money to swallow it up and increase the value of the dollar. It turns out that all the money landed in the big monopoly owners. The federal government demanded that they turn in a majority profit to help increase the dollar again, and so they did. Quickly, the amount of money in circulation was lowered, and the prices of goods did too. People were again able to make a living. Chapter 10. 500th Fifth Avenue Building. As the economic situation got better, TJP wanted to make a bank, and he wanted to make it something special. Something no one has ever seen before. Something luxurious. Something with class. Something amazing. He asked Mining Co. and Construction Co. to build a nearly to scale 500th Fifth Avenue building in Manhattan. After long negotiations, we struck a deal, landing me with a lot of work. The last skyscraper built in Manhattan was the Empire State Building, and it was by far the best looking tower in the city. So again, I set off to the internet to get a very beautiful building schematic. I eventually landed on a design from a massive Manhattan Minecraft recreation project on Planet Minecraft. The builds in that world were incredible, and after showing some of the buildings to the people of New York, they wanted to tear down our current builds to replace them with these impressive designs. Thanks to mods and the industrial boom, we were able to arm ourselves to the roof with crazy new contraptions to make one of these buildings come to life in our own world. So I began work on clearing space in Manhattan. Once that was finished, we began building the machinery needed to help some parts of the construction of the building. Once all of that was finished, we began construction on April 17th, 2021 at 12 a.m. This build required blocks from biomes we've never found, so me and my, at the time, partner and governor of Connecticut, No Scope, ventured off. After about 5 hours of searching, we headed back home to supply the machinery. This was just the beginning of our problems to come. I had No Scope man the machinery while I traveled the states gathering resources to fuel the machines. This constant battle took 2 hours until we got to the upper floors. The building required quartz blocks for every floor, and that was nearly impossible even with our machinery to get the blocks from the nether, so we ended up with a compromise. Mining Co. had a surplus of andesite from the failed transatlantic mining project. We began converting all of the andesite into polished andesite to use as a replacement for the quartz blocks. This wasn't the end of gathering quartz, however. During the tedious process of filling the machinery with quartz to lay the floors, to then break the floors and replacing them by hand with polished andesite, hundreds of quartz blocks were lost during the process, and each floor kept around 15 blocks for the elevator landing. So we had to keep regenerating the losses during the process. Days with no sleep, we pushed on, working to ensure the beast of a build would be finished properly until a mistake happened. One of the settings on our machines reset the building process and was replacing all of the blocks we already laid, causing thousands of dollars in waste blocks and hours of wasted time. After manually fixing the build and making up for our losses, we pushed on. It wasn't long before the new skyscraper took it to the next level, exceeding the height of the other skyscrapers by nearly double. We were exhausted, and before I knew it, I was building the thing on my own. I kept pushing on, and on, and on, and eventually, we reached the top. The height was unbelievable. I ran cables through the building, and jumped off it, and laid the finishing touches for this masterpiece. I have to give credit to the people on the Manhattan Minecraft Recreation Project on Planet Minecraft for creating the design. I heaved a sigh, signed some documents, and took a break to just gaze at the skyline. Chapter 11: A Lifeless City. After the 505th Avenue building was complete, a lot of people ran out of stamina to keep moving on. Strenuous work caused everyone to become exhausted. People took a break from the server to come back another time. Not many things happened over this time. Chapter 12: Virginia. A month after the construction of the 505th Avenue building, people wanted to leave New York once again. To try avoiding problems, I reluctantly let people settle in their own state outside of New York. The only ties where they couldn't cause problems, and they needed to be connected to the Transcontinental Railroad. TJP 0630 was the decided leader of the settlement. He asked me to build a fortress for them to get started. I went down to Virginia and built my fort. Not much progress was made for a while. It was just a place for people to settle outside of the city. This settlement grew enough to join the Union, and got great tremendous benefits and growth because of it. Chapter 13: Time and Efficiency. While Virginia was being formed, I went back to my businesses to see what I could do to make them stronger. My main goal was to make oil refining more efficient. In search of a better process, I bought 2 properties in Bronx that contained 2 oil reservoirs. I began looking into another oil process. I started building facilities on my newly purchased properties, and set up a pump and the new refining equipment. Getting all the resources for the setup was more difficult than expected, but eventually it was finished. I started processing oil as soon as possible. I quickly discovered that the new process was way more efficient than the old process at a sacrifice to time. It takes an astronomical amount of time to process enough oil to fill up the tanks for usage. Since this is the case, it is decided to run this setup not for a primary refining setup for all reservoirs. Over time, I built up emergency reservoirs of these new fuels in case of a disaster that wasn't far away. Chapter 14: Supply and Demand. It wasn't long before certain people began asking for more difficult materials to build complex machinery. People began needing the byproducts of nuclear fission. We didn't really need the power produced by this new generator, but it wouldn't hurt. As the money came in, I began researching for safe designs to build a small fission reactor in New York. I landed on a sodium-cooled reactor. This new reactor could process fissile fuels into power, with the cost of nuclear waste. Once the reactor was finished, we began running it for power and waste. Shortly after, we began converting the waste into plutonium and spent waste that would slowly, naturally dissipate safely. This new reactor presented a safety problem in New York City. If someone were to break the wrong tube or destroy the wrong block, it could cover and contaminate all of Manhattan in radioactive material, killing everything in it. Doing so would be considered griefing on the server. As New York was expanding and factories were being created, the demand for electricity outdid the supply from NYSEG. I began looking for a new, extremely efficient reactor to power New York City. Nuclear fusion was the answer. To build this reactor, we would need a lot of plutonium and space. Thankfully, we had built the new fission reactor, which produces a lot of plutonium. I took the surplus of plutonium I had stored up and made all the stuff I needed to build the fusion reactor. After the reactor was finished, I began construction on the fuel processing plant. To make the fuel for this reactor, we needed a lot of space to build huge thermal evaporation plants and water pumps. We had a large open space on Staten Island to put the processing plant on. After about a week, I ran pipes to the reactor, finishing the fuel processing plant. We started the reactor. The reactor started up and was producing more energy than we've ever seen before. It was a near unlimited amount of power, nearly no limits. After the reactor was finished, we began making more battery backup for NYSEG. Once all was done, New York City had more energy than it could ask for. This burst of energy would be interrupted not long from now. Chapter 15: The Energy Crisis. After finishing the fusion reactor, we began working to improve its power output. People wanted more power for New York, so we quickly went to work. After about a day, we improved the efficiency of our fuel process to the point where we would never become short on fuel for the reactor. With this sorted out, we can now push the reactor to its limits. Finally, we were swimming in power. No more outages, no more waiting. Instantaneous power from anywhere in the state. After a couple days, we began to notice something strange. The power taps in the NYSEG customer buildings were lowering on charge. I went to investigate. I went to check the battery backups, and they were laying on the brink of death. I quickly notified NYSEG customers and met with all the engineers at NYSEG. At the time, nobody was sure what happened. The clock was ticking. NYSEG powers tons of large and small-scale factories across New York City that demand power. After some discussing, we couldn't pinpoint the problem. Before we knew it, the battery backup system was drained, and NYSEG customers began calling in. The lack of power created a panic. After some further research, we were able to find the problem. The fusion reactor that was powering the city failed. We tried restarting the reactor multiple times and couldn't get it to turn over. I figured too much time has passed, and further downtime could cause an effect on the economy. I quickly made a deal between Rockefeller Oil Industries and NYSEG to build large power plants in the same day to run on fossil fuels. By the end of the day, 2 large-scale diesel power plants were finished, and were then powering the city. Customers again were able to power up certain machinery and get back to making product. While we were burning through fossil reserves, we began investigation on the failed reactor. A couple days of investigation, and we determined that a bug in the mod caused the structure to come to a complete stop and turn off when the chunk is unloaded. This only happened if we gassed up the reactor. Knowing this, we turned the reactor down to an above-average fuel injection levels. This resulted in less power but gave high stability. By that point, New York City was already becoming more fossil dependent, and the market for fossil fuel power sprang up due to everyone's negative views on the stability of nuclear energy. This new demand for crude products made an explosion in the economy, as orders rushed in from other states and regions of the country. Oil was truly becoming king overnight. As time went on, Rockefeller Oil Industries was too busy pocketing the cash than trying to expand their operation. They believed demand could be met with their small operation. Turns out they sold all of their products within a week of the end of the crisis. They couldn't and wouldn't expand their business, since the demand for crude products was so high. Prices of crude products skyrocketed as the shortage began. People were willing to pay the extreme prices for the quality product. Eventually it got to a point where Rockefeller was charging $10,000 for 1 barrel of diesel. This wouldn't last long, as the federal government began looking into Rockefeller Oil Industries to stop their fishy practices. Eventually, new facilities sprouted up and the demand for crude products was met as supply rose and newer and more efficient types of refining setups were deployed. Today, our United States is almost completely fossil dependent in most areas due to oil's long-lasting reputation for being a reliable source of power. Chapter 16. Getting Stale. The server is known for having spikes of interest. One week people are playing, the next they're not. It's just in its nature at this point. During this time, few people made their appearance on the server, and it would be a while before something worthwhile would happen. Chapter 17. A Carbon Nation. The downtime from the energy disaster costed New York companies plenty of money. This was a big hit to the wallet, they would remember. Businesses began spending mucho money on carbon-based fuels. This fad began to spread rapidly across the nation. It began with New York State and spread as far as Alaska. Companies were willing to drop a little coin on fuel if it were to keep factories running. Power plants began popping up across the states burning coal, diesel, kerosene, gas, LPG, and ethylene. This, in return, created some groups that believed that the mass usage of fossil fuels would ruin our environment. Oil companies began paying lobbyists to pass a bill that prohibits national use of nuclear fission and fusion across all states. Chapter 18. The Thailandist Menace. Not long after environmentalist groups were squashed, the government started to be filled with corruption. This became apparent after a new organization, the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, was founded by the government with Standard Oil to regulate small business use of oil. People began questioning the government. Soon a book was published named The Thailandist Manifesto. This book described the economic trauma small business owners dealt from the policies the government implemented, from banning cheap energy and forcing oil monopolies down their throats. The author pointed out the flaws in the American quote-unquote democracy and made it apparent to the readers the government was a charade put on by the dictator at its center, while presenting a modern form of government that could fix the flaws of the current. All eyes began looking at President Tyler MMA 2014 as the man behind the curtain, after they discovered his ties with Standard Oil and transactions made to lobbyists to pass anti-nuclear and cheap energy legislation. People began asking for their power back. quickly rearranged what the president could do and say, and separated him from his personal life. The leftover power became a position: the vice president. Chapter 19. Vice Presidential Race. Political parties began to form quickly as the race began. The Republican Party, Constitutionalist Party, and the Thailandist Workers' Party all got their nominees ready for the first debates. The Republican VP nominee Gaming Gamers was a very outrageous and petty person who reached as far as he could in an argument to make sure he gets votes. The Constitutionalist VP nominee TJP0630 spoke only of preserving America and helping those who were hurt by the energy crisis and oil policy. The Thailandist VP nominee NoScope3321 gave a roaring speech with great emotion to drive to the people the frustration of the working class citizens that lacked representation in the government and paid with non-stop labor and factories to make do in life. It wasn't long before the Republican VP nominee was kicked out of the race, leaving the Constitutionalist VP nominee TJP0630, the Thailandist VP nominee NoScope3321 to duke it out in the final debates and leave it to the voters. Thailandist VP nominee NoScope pointed out the incoming economic disaster caused by the government's legislature and cornered TJP0630 with a gotcha. The ballot box was almost too close to call, but resulted in a Thailandist VP win. Chapter 20. American Reformation Movements. Once the Thailandist VP nominee NoScope3321 won the election, he began talks of government reform. He began talks of a Thailandist system. People were spooked at such radical moves so early into the vice president's term. The Republican Party and the Constitutionalist Party began a merger into the American Preservationist Party to try to protect the American way of government from the radical moves. The Thailandist Workers' Party began silently working in the background to try to completely rework the American government by using the incoming economic and health crisis as an example that the system needs to be reformed. Chapter 21. Freshwater Crisis. After a server update, people began to notice a feature that wasn't there before. Players now had a thirst bar. This required players to drink water to prevent exhaustion, dehydration, and death. Quickly, the government formed the CDC and began working with NICEAG and Parasol Pharmaceutical Company to try to quickly deploy drinking water to people across the nation. NICEAG began constructing water lines in the sewers with tax dollars gathered by the emergency use of the New York State governor. The CDC and Parasol began creating stations across the city that handed out free drinking water to tax-paying citizens. This only lasted a couple days, but cost the taxpayers and businesses tens of thousands of dollars. People became even more frustrated with how unprepared the government was for a predetermined disaster. Chapter 22. Day Trading Nightmare. While the freshwater crisis ran on in the background, the stock market ran on forward as the money poured into the market due to the disaster. Eventually, the market began to stagnate for a while, after companies began to continue to break even every quarter on profits to costs. Eventually, a rumor began to spread that communication and oil companies have hit a roadblock in research and development. Shareholders started to worry. Eventually, the domino effect started. One after another began selling shares in fear of never getting a return on their investments, and eventually the market turned to chaos. Chapter 23. Reforming America. It was not long before the unrest grew in the country over the poor job the government had been doing. Quickly, the Thailandist Workers' Party made their move. Representatives of the party began meeting behind closed doors with other political party leaders and discussing their ideologies. Other political parties made a deal with the Thailandist Workers' Party, for they would help prevent radical changes that could cause tyranny down the road during the American Reformation. The vice president began drafting policies that would later be implemented into the new Thailandist system. Chapter 24. Thailandist Implementation. A week or so passes and radical changes had ran their course. The former American system was replaced with the new, modern, up-to-date Thailandist government. Quickly, workers united to construct a government building on the long-neglected Staten Island. This building was a new, modern design that featured a fountain in the front, with efficiently occupied space. Within that building, the first ruling party election began. The election ended with the Thailandist Workers' Party landslide. Once the party was fully settled in, immense work began fixing the problems of the former government. The party ensured all peoples of the country were satisfied with their water. Residents without water would have a free system installed in their household. Next, they set out on fixing the economy. The ruling party decided to run more oil power plants to create a demand for oil. This sparked research and development teams within these companies to set out again on improving their products. The government also decided to sell land on Staten Island to fund New York infrastructure. Quickly overnight, the city was more alive than ever. People began to celebrate the new government's foundation. The service future was looking brighter than ever. Chapter 25. Staten Island Expansion. Once the Thailandist government building was created on Staten Island, companies began looking to buy land and create businesses in the Staten Island area. Restaurants and offices began to sprout up around the government building. Eventually, a copper bridge was built to connect Staten Island to Brooklyn for the first time. Eventually, more government and businesses began to sprout up, making Staten Island one of the most modern locations of the tri-state area. Chapter 26. People's Reclamation Army and the Ministry. Shortly after the ruling party was elected, they decided to create a ministry and a military for the state. The ministry was created to be an enforcer of law and another branch of the people's voice in the government. The ministry was designed to be made up of non-political party-affiliated, elected state representatives to guide the economy and military of the country while working with the ruling party of the Thailandist state. The ministry was designed to handle legal disputes and anything that wasn't going to affect the state on a national level. The ministry would elect a military advisor that would work closely with the People's Reclamation Army, as well as the ruling party's members. The People's Reclamation Army is made up of 3 regiments with 2 battalions and 4 companies each. These regiments all have a niche. The 1st Regiment is in charge of defending the state from a foreign invader. It's run by 2 first lieutenant colonels that oversee both combat battalions. These colonels must report to the military advisor, chairman, and chairman's secretary. The 2nd Regiment is in charge of offensive moves during war, and the 3rd Regiment is the National Guard, with a sworn duty to assist the state in any means necessary. Legislature was drafted to ensure the state and the ministry of the people could prevent a tyrannical ruling party from using the military to create an authoritarian state. The same legislature also protects the ruling party from a tyrannical ministry. The state and ministry also are protected from treasonous military via court-martialing. Chapter 27. Infrastructure. After the final kinks in the government chain were worked out, the newly formed government began pushing to fulfill promises made before the Thailandists took power. Not long, the ruling party began discussions with the public on restoring the image of the great city of New York. This new infrastructure would help restore the economy, and some, while benefiting the people of New York. Quickly, the government began making deals with industrial companies to help fix up and better the city where they were stationed. Mining Co., Construction Co., and Standard Oil were all hired by the government to update the coast of the islands and build bridges to connect the boroughs. They were also tasked to fix broken down railroads and to help eastern expansion. Companies worked tirelessly to build up the city to be better than ever before. Shortly after, the new industrial New York started to take its shape. Drastic changes were made to the city, helping not only improve citizens' daily lives, but to better represent the industrial metropolis it actually was. Chapter 28: Central Park Tower. The city was revamping itself quickly, and the ruling party of the state wanted to ensure victory in its next election. Talk began in closed doors on how to secure the party's place as victor in the upcoming election. Talks began on opening a park, and others thought of growing a financial district to better demonstrate the new government and city's wealth. Eventually, it was decided that building a central park would put the stake in the election, guaranteeing victory. The problem was building a park wouldn't satisfy the party's drive to show the people of the country their determination to better their lives. It was then decided to construct Central Park Tower. The construction of this tower would not only change the New York skyline forever, but leave a permanent mark of the hard work of the party in the people that see it every day. Chapter 29: Mining Expansion. Shortly after Central Park Tower was completed, a change was made to the server involving automated mining systems. No longer was the city equipped with high-speed, efficient auto miners. They were made nearly useless after the update increased the ticks it took to get ore. Now, Mining Co., the server's mining monopoly, would have to search for a fix to the problem. Following the update disaster, Mining Co. would form a trust with a company by the name of TBD Co., or TJ's Block Destruction Company. This trust was made to get around the government's intervention in Mining Co. operations overseas. A plan was formed by executives to create a colony by the name of Arizona in a Badlands biome to employ a New York City workforce to move freshly mined ores by train from the colony. The government supported the mining venture and began construction of a high-speed railway to the colony. 2 days following the beginning of the mining in the colony, the people of Elko arrived by rail with the first steam train to begin loading ores. The colony brought a supply of fresh material to the people along with economic growth due to the mass employment of miners. Executives of Mining Co. began interested in the possibility that this newly formed colony may be rich in oil. Standard Oil representatives were sent to the colony to sample for reservoirs. Results showed multiple reservoirs of immense size. Mining Co. decided not to capitalize on the oil traditionally. Mining Co. employed oil refining experts to help management of the colony construct a small-scale refinery setup. This new refinery would produce fuels for power generation and large-scale lighting. Mining Co. instructed TBD Co. to create gas lines beneath the colony and its mine. These new gas lines would fuel large-scale lighting systems across the colony. Utilizing kerosene gas for lighting instead of coal created less lag and a more efficient light source for the colony. Shortly after the use of gas lighting was in practice, word spread to New York about the benefits of gas lighting and how NYSEG should begin to implement it. Although it was a great idea, it would require tons of construction and fallback systems to be constructed, which would cost a lot of money. That's all, folks. Sorry about the wait, but it's finally here. Took a little longer than expected, no thanks to some difficulties. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot longer than the previous history video. And here's to the next year in the MC SMP History Part 3.